We're launching into class number 3 of Mystery Monday Monthly. And as you can see, we're going to be working with what's called the signature block. However, the signature block, mostly looking like it's for a signature, becomes a great element for lots of options for borders. In this one you're seeing, I took a crazy quilt block and I bordered it with the leftovers that I had of the fabrics by making these signature pieces around the outside edge, and I did a double row. That's one of the illustrations in your handout that shows you how to craft that. Now I will be real honest with you about how this works is that you have to sometimes put a coping strip around to make sure you have that element figured out so that the corners turn out, quote, correct. However, be open to creating a border on just two sides on each of the diagonals. Those make really fascinating borders too. This was a lot of fun to use up the rest of my scraps for. Now the next one that I'm showing you is a really fascinating one that is not written with a signature block, but after I've studied it, I see that we had a lot of potential in there. And you're going to see as we get close up on this that this quilt pattern was made entirely with squares and half squares. So you see where those signature block pieces are? You can start seeing that what they did was they put those together as squares and half squares. So it's lots of tiny piecing. So look at where those signature blocks are to finish this out. So signature blocks are a great helper unit that's going to save you time, and you aren't going to have to be piecing together unnecessarily fabrics of the same color to create those shapes. This is what the AccuQuilt companions, corners, and angles do for you, is they keep you from having to create convoluted, painful pieces that are a lot of piecing that's not necessary. So that would be one entire unit in the signature unit. So it's a great way to look at this. So let's unpack what this looks like in working with the fabrics. I'm going to start off with some of my scraps, and these are the Eloise fabrics that I chose from. And you're going to see the Eloise fabrics. This is leftovers from another quilt. So what I'm doing is as I looked at these pieces, I have been playing with them for a little bit for Mystery Mondays and other things. And as I unpack this, I'm kind of taking resource of what I have for units. Most of my units turned out to be more than 4.5 inches. So I've decided to go ahead and use these with an 8-inch cube because that's the size of my units in an 8-inch cube are 4.5 by 2.5 inch units. And so I'm going to be able to get a series of these. My plan is to cut all of this up and use it up. I do not know how big this quilt is. I'm going to guess it's maybe a baby quilt, which would be terrific because I could put this together with an Eloise book, and these are leftovers from other things. This was one of the backgrounds that I had used in one of the quilts that we had done. When we make kits out of quilts, we always have our sample maker stitch them up before we make them available to you. Now you can see I have some other fabrics that I put in there. Here's some gray and white polka dots that I thought would go well with it, and that's how I'm going to stash that together. So now I'm going to go through and I'm going to start sorting the fabrics as to my usable pieces. Now I chose this piece as my background, and this is a linen looking charcoal gray. As I've said to you before, when you find these great basics, make sure you get 4 to 6 yards of them, because as you're seeing with Mystery Monday and other things that we do, they're great companions to have in your stash. And what you want to do is you want to have enough of those, and they're going to become friends. Now the other one is I always count on the salvage to tell me what it is in case I come back. So now I'm going to audition these red and gray and white pieces. Now I chose this charcoal in particular because the Eloise units have white with black. So while I would normally like to use a white with this, I really want those little elements to stand out because in those fabrics, what they end up having is the sayings from the book. So paraphrases from the book are in them, and I do not want to take those away. So this charcoal is a great option. I prefer that over black because then it doesn't do away with, I have some black fabrics in there. I don't want to lose those in there either. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with one of the units, and I'm going to be showing you how you would cut this if you were doing this traditionally. Now the way to cut this piece is that if I was doing it from an 8-inch size, I'm going to cut a 4.5-inch square out of this. And as you can see, I cut away from my right side and the top, then I swing it around and I trim it out. I prefer this to squaring up the block on the left side first, because that gives me the elements to be as square as possible. Now if you notice there, I've got my charcoal color, and these are going to be my corners. Now when you see signature blocks, how you see them typically done is what they will do is they will take those units and put them out in the corners and as small squares. And so out of this one, I'm going to cut just out of the polka dot, because this is going to be a sample to show you how I'm going to be working with it. Now that line on the left side is straight, and so I'm going to go ahead and cut these down into 2.5-inch squares. I start out by cutting out at 5, and then I back off to 2.5. The reason I do that is then I don't have to lift my ruler so much and cause myself to have a reposition. It's also good for my brain to keep doing that math. Now, traditionally, how they would have you do this is I would normally use my point-to-point turner, but I'm going to be sewing a diagonal line on there. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew it on, finger press it on the fold, and then I'm going to lay that down there, and when I go to my sewing machine, I'm going to be sewing this on a diagonal. This is the only way that I recommend these be done with traditional piecing, is the double squares. So you can see what it's going to look like if I was to use that polka dot. And there we go. That's all a signature block is. Now, why would I want to use AccuQuilt? Well, a couple reasons. One is that if I use that square big enough, I'll be able to reuse those squares and I don't have as much waste. The top reason for using a die that has the sections cut out is that I'm going to end up not having quite so much waste of fabric. Plus, the pieces that are hidden under those foldovers are usable for other things. I later on chose to cut all of them up into small half-square triangles, which is going to give me another option to this signature block. Now, as I go through my fabrics and I look at what I'm going to be making with these, I'm going to send it through the cutter and I'll be cutting those signature blocks, and I can cut them up in stacks. Now, let's go back and look at this. If I was to try to do this traditionally, to cut out those angles, what I have to look at is very convoluted. So you're seeing me here, what I tried to do was see, could I cut these off to make them match the signature block? And while I could, it was I was able to successfully get this done. However, when it came down to getting that piece out there, I could not get that to match up. There was not a line that worked well on this. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you, if I was to cut this as a half-square triangle, as I need for those other pieces out of that strip, there would be a 2.5-inch strip. And as you saw that chop that I used over that leftover fabric, I was able to get that so I could flip the ruler over once, and there I'd get a half-square triangle. Now let's see if I can get another one out of that little piece. It's close. It'll work. It'll work mostly to show you the sample of this. This is sometimes the way we think about these pieces, and so if I was going to put that square on there and fold it back, that's where it's going to position. So that line that my fold line is, that's actually my sewing line. That means if I were to put the half square triangle down there, that outer point, that point towards the toe lower left, has to match where that square is. So what I looked at was, how much fabric would I have to take off of that corner? Now I can't take it off at that fold because the fold is my sew line, which means I have to back it off to 2 inches. And I tried this, and I tried to play with it, and I tried to figure it out. And while I got it cut, it wasn't great. So I'm trying to figure out here what line on my ruler works with that to get it matched to that. And truly, it was close to 2. It was almost 2 1/4. It did not work out. Now here's the cool thing with AccuQuilt. When they make these dies, they test them extensively. They're done for sewing with an accurate 1/4 inch. All the math is spot on. It's spot on to English piecing. When I mean English piecing, that means 1/4 inches and 1/2 inches. So I went ahead and thought, well, I'll try one and I'll see, is that going to fit on there? And as you can see, you could play with this and get this to work. My recommendation is that you make sure that if you're an AccuQuilt user, you get that corners companion. This one is going to be a great die for quilts, for borders, for other things. If you are doing it traditional piecing, I'm going to recommend that you cut them at the 2.5 and 4.5 inch squares. If you're cutting it smaller, you could cut it at 2 inches and 3.5 inches. So that's from a 6-inch cube. If you were cutting it bigger, then you have to figure out those pieces. Now, as I went through my scraps, my sample maker, my friend, Betty Jo, loved this fabric so much that she left all these tiny scraps in there. So what I decided to do was separate them out. And so here you're watching me separate these out as to what are usable pieces for the signature blocks, as to what are 2.5 inch strips that I'll be able to cut up into maybe half square triangles, and what are the little tiny strips. And so I'm sorting them out to those pieces that I can figure together. And these are all my pieces that I'm going to be cutting out of my signature blocks. Now you're watching me there cut these out almost at like a 5-inch unit. I'm stacking them up in 6s so that I can take them over to my AccuQuilt. And so I've used every single usable piece. And then the pieces that are littler than that are going to be similar to those 2-inch strips that were left over, I'm going to put into that border piece. Now I'm going to my AccuQuilt. I have everything stacked up. And there's my mats. I'm going to test these out. And if you notice, they're on there slightly at an angle when you use AccuQuilt. And I like to pitch it through the cutter at a sharper angle, because what you're doing is when you don't go in straight, it is actually going against the grain, which gives you a cleaner cut. So at this point, I'm going ahead and I'm removing those pieces. If I find usable pieces out of those corners that I might be able to cut out more of the 5 from the die number 5, I'm going to set those aside. And there's one of my first signature blocks. And I tested that out just to see how it would turn out, make sure I get my system in place. Now this other unit that I have, that I've sent through, I'm cutting some of my 2-inch finished half square triangles. Now I want you to watch as I am struggling with this. I use this die number 5, probably more than any other die that I have. And I would recommend that, so what you're starting to see is my top layer is not coming out as sharp. Now I can't say that this is dull, but I probably cut 50 times more than the average person because of the way that I demonstrate, and this is my first cube that I had. I did find that by using that cube, was it time to replace it? Well, you can buy replacement dies, and you talk to us about that. But the other one that I would recommend that you look at is that there is a 2-inch finished half square triangle that will yield you on the board. So it has a 9 patch of half square triangles. That means that it's going to make 18 for each one. 18 times 6, that's how many you could set them through on a bigger die. So it's one that if you do a lot of small half square triangles, which we do out of the 2-inch finished from the 8-inch cube, I would invest in that die board. So here's more of the signature blocks. And like I said, what I keep is on your, if you have a go big, on that go big, on the outer parts of that, there's little magnets, and I keep a little pair of scissors. The only piece it's not catching consistently is my top layer. I have tried to change the mats out. That was one of the things. I have tried to send it through at an angle. I have had this particular AccuQuilt cube probably for 7 years, And so that's a lot of cutting on that little die number 5. I left this in here because I wanted you to see that, they last way, way longer than your rotary blade. But you might want to consider some of those things like investing in that larger piece. Now in this one, because I sent it through at a sharper point, it looks like it got that top layer more square and it came out easier. Okay, so I'm going to keep sending those pieces through. Now the other thing that I find that sometimes affects the efficacy of using the AccuQuilt die is if a fabric, there's some fabrics that you see out there in cotton fabrics that are, I'm going to call them a little silkier. So they have a tendency to not have quite so much body or definitely not so much starching in them. So I'm not a pre-washer because frankly, when they get your fabric ready to roll, it has a starch in it. I'm not going to restarch, wash and then restarch all my fabrics. That's something that I paid for if I bought good quality fabric from an independent store. I have confidence in it. In all the years that I've done quilting, I've had a few fabrics that, and when I say a few, I mean like 3 that have what we call bleeding. What bleeding is that the dye migrates from one fabric to the other. So we have solutions for that we'd be happy to talk to you about. I've had a lot of success with the products that we carry. We carry products that are safe to use. I don't do well with die catchers if I have a fabric that migrates, a color that migrates over substantially. It doesn't keep it sustainably from migrating again. So we have some solutions that we'd be happy to talk to you about. Notice that when I'm sending my dies through the cutter, what I'm doing is I'm sending it as a sharper angle. When you, on the dies, all of the elements that are on there are at an angle. They're not square with the outer frame of the die. And that's because on the weft and the weave of the fabric, if you send it through straight, it's going to go through where you're going to end up going against the grain of the fabric, which is going to give you a cleaner cut. I send it through at a sharper pitch because then it gives you even better cutting. Now when you watch AccuQuilt's videos, they will tell you to send your fabric always through length of the grain through the cutter. And that's because what you're doing is that very element is you're going against the grain. And they say you must always do it that way and you must always have your dies with the label facing you, your belly. And what I find is that I don't tend to want to mess with that way, which means I'm a little bit more tolerant of occasionally having to cut those straight threads and then also being willing to send it through at a sharper pitch. And that's just, there's nothing wrong with your die. That just helps perform better. So let's head to sewing. We're going to look at something that's called presser foot pressure. And that's the amount of pressure that goes down on your presser foot. This is adjustable on some machines. This machine in particular that I'm working on is new to me. And so I found this. This is the image that goes along with it. I also have the ability on this machine to push a question mark and find out what that is. This tells you how you can adjust that presser foot pressure. And what ends up happening is that most machines have their machine set up so that you get the optimal garment sewing presser foot pressure tension. What I like to do is lower that tension down when I'm dealing with only 2 layers of cotton. How I audition this is when I send the fabric through, what tends to happen is one of the fabrics migrates. It moves a little bit more than the other one. So that's when I want to adjust it. In this case, I am adjusting that presser foot pressure tension down. Now on this particular machine, and on most machines, presser foot pressure tension is not something that sticks when you turn the machine off and on. On Bernina machines, they have temporary altered stitch memory. This means as long as I have the machine on, this particular feature, presser foot pressure tension, will default back to normal. That's because I don't want to have to remember it later on to go back to it. And I can set it back to default by just clicking on that button that was yellow. Now it's blue. Now to the fun part. Let's start building some signature blocks. Now if you notice on this, I happen to have on this particular machine, it is a new feature on many of the Berninas, and it's a laser light. You can see it's right underneath that little red light underneath the needle. That shows me exactly where that point goes, where it's going to be stitching. I adore what this does. It'll actually go where the angle is. Now, if you notice on this piece, I've got that square, and I'm auditioning to see what happens if I put an AccuQuilt cut triangle on that square. Can I get it to go into the correct place? And so I've put that on. I've got my Annie's tailors all in place. And then that laser light is going to go exactly where that piece is. Now what I want to do is I'm first going to take one of my squares because I know that's going to fit, and that's the traditional piecing. And if you notice where that laser light beam is it's right in that fold. And then I don't have to watch the needle because the laser light is going where my next stitch is going to be. Isn't that cool? I thought this was a really great feature. This is a new feature to me. For my birthday, I upgraded it to machines, and I hate to say it, but I love that feature, and I love to say this, it was worth me adding this machine to my toolbox. Now, while we're talking about that, we've got that square that went through, and we attached the small square to it. This is the traditional piecing, and as we're going through there, I'm going to be getting ready to chain piece this to my next piece. And so this is how I tend to work consistently. Now I'm going to pull one of my AccuQuilt pieces out, and this was cut with that signature die, die number 10, which is in the corners companion. And if you notice, I raise that with my freehand system. That is a lever that is next to my knee, and what I do is I push over on that so I can keep both hands on my work. Because I'm curious, I'm taking my Ginger clips back there to the back, and I'm clipping away that ender from my project before. This is traditional piecing. I do this consistently. Is I never send through 100 of these and come back and do this because I am a little distracted, and I tend to work a little bit more efficiently when I work this way. So as you're looking at that, I have that piece in there. A lot of instructions tell you to cut out both those back pieces. I do not recommend you cut out both those back pieces because when you cut both of them out at the same time, you lose that corner on that red fabric. And the corner on the red fabric is a better gauge of the size of that block than that gray triangle. You can see on one side it's slightly off. So I would be using, when I seam that, the background of that red fabric. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm looking at that, and you can see how close I cut that. So my red fabric is there. I noticed when I put this piece in, I didn't have it accurate. And so I cut it kind of close there. And so what I want to do is I'm going in and seam ripping this. When I seam rip with that Clover seam ripper, I'm pulling out about every third to fifth stitch. I turn it over, and then I remove that bobbin thread. Voila, done fast. Seam ripping should never make you swear. The best thing to do is invest in a good seam ripper. This brand actually has 2 handle formats on it. It is inexpensive. You should have one by every sewing machine. There's no reason you have to get up and go to the other side and find the other side of your room and take your one seam ripper out. Okay, now I'm trying it with that AccuQuilt triangle that puts on there. And that's only because I have those 2 corners. You cannot cut it with the 2 corners with your specialty ruler. So now I'm going to chain piece another one of my signature blocks in. I also like, on this machine in particular, and I've always liked that the Bernina has an accurate 1/4 inch. This one, for some reason, maybe it's because it was my birthday gift, but I think it's because of the engineering they've put into the machine, is probably one of the best tracking wide feed dog machines I've ever seen. So when I say wide feed dogs, this machine has 9mm stitching options. That means my feed dogs are wider than a normal traditional machine. and that's because it gives me wider stitch options. They work great for piecing. We recommend that you always have a straight stitch plate on there. So I'm going in and I'm working through these pieces and I'm getting them done. The other reason for working on my blocks incrementally is if I get interrupted, I would have maybe a handful of finished blocks rather than half of 100 blocks. I just don't want to do that to myself. It doesn't respect who I am, and it also gives me the chance next time I sit down, I would actually look at a stack of finished units rather than a whole stack of half finished units. It's a psychological reality for us, and as creatives, you need to respect who you are. Now, if you notice on this one, this is the one that I tried to cut with using the specialty ruler. And you could see the way that triangle lined up on there. It came up the wrong size. And so it was a little disappointing. Like I said, when we were cutting that, I said you can do it. Some things you can do, but you shouldn't. And just because you can doesn't mean you should do it. Now, if you notice on this Eloise fabric, they have a diagonal print. I am not going to get wigged out that my piecing diagonal does not match that diagonal. And I would not have cut it another way. I'm just fine with it looking this way because I liked, when I laid it out that way, I chose that the Eloise fabric showed up better if I respected that long diagonal. Now I'm going back behind. You can see this is that one that I tried to traditionally cut out that piece. And you can see the corners are off slightly. Now I'm going to keep using that because that error is within 1/4 of an inch. So I could leave it that way, or the other thing I could do is I could go back and adjust it. This is painful. So if you notice that first part I started, I cut it about every 3rd to 5th stitch, but I'm showing you the other thing that you can do with a good quality seam ripper. You can put it in there and you can cut that rest of that seam that way. So now I'm going to re-engineer this unit, and I'm going to have to look at what is the actual line. Now I'm gauging this up against one of the signature dies that I have, and you can see how far off that is. That's considerable, and it's not really something easy to resolve. So what I decided to do was take that piece and then put another triangle against it, but I'm adjusting the width of that. So now I have an AccuQuilt cut number 5, and I'm going blind on the back side and going to ignore where that unit is. So I'm going to go back. Look at how Eloise is looking so adorable on this 8-inch cube. If I would have used a 6-inch cube, because I only had units that were like 4 inches or less, I probably would have lost some of those larger elements of Eloise's face and her cute little pug dog. So that also impacts the size of the cube that you use. So I'm going to go ahead and keep working through on these signature pieces. So let's talk about that. I used to think that a 12-inch cube or a 16-inch cube corners was too big. But if I have a fabric that's maybe my favorite State College fabric and I want to preserve as much of the elements as possible, that is where I would use a corners out of a 16-inch and a 12-inch. So if you've watched me doing presentations before, I used to say to people, don't bother to buy the corners for those bigger pieces. The more I play with them, the more I found other options for them. And you should not miss the chance to do the signature block. So as you notice when I'm working through these pieces on this one, I am chain piecing groups of them together because the signature block is one of the fastest blocks for you to ever be able to piece a whole bunch of for a border or for an entire quilt. And I found it went faster. I still on those first elements worked through this. You have to decide who you are. Now this is my chain piece cutter. It uses a recycled blade from an Olfa cutter, for one of my rotary cutters, my older ones. I keep those in a jar. I went out and pulled an old one out and put it in that cutter. So now I'm going through and I'm doing that seam pressing with my point-to-point turner. Now, at this point, I had those little strips that were left over. And like I said, Betty Jo, I'm sure, left them in there because she just thought they were too cute to throw away. And so what I did was I trimmed them all down to 5-inch lengths, and I started sewing them together into twosies and then foursies because one, I wanted to pick them up right away and make sure I have them for a border. And I start cutting the chain piecing in between, and I stitch them all together as one very long border piece. So I'm working on my border, and I could have worked on this as enders and leaders in between my other elements. And I chose not to because honestly, this took me probably 15 minutes total to put all those together. And then I didn't have those little scraps sitting around waiting to get lost. It was really a blast to do. And there were not very many fabrics. I believe in this collection there were probably maybe 10 fabrics that I used for this. And I used it as a fat quarter collection. And so these are using up all the leftovers. This could be a frame around something. It could be, it could be actually an element. It could be sashings. I can trim it down further. I would not trim this down further than the 5 inches for my purposes that I'm using. I could trim it down to 4.5 inches if I needed it as a spacer for my other block units. But by doing this, putting this together now, and then ironing out the whole long strip, I now have made fabric. And that's what I'm doing with my scraps here. So I've got a nice stack up there. It's getting longer, you can see. This is fun just sometimes to piece together for kicks. And like I said, it makes good use of those little scraps that I typically wouldn't. And as you see when I'm putting these in, they're not all the same width. They're close, but they're not all the same width, which is really great because when I go to trim them up, if I decide to put them as a border around something, I will just cut in between any of those units, and I won't have to unseam anything or do any math on it. Let's look at some quilts. Now, taking just the signature blocks and putting them together, I have lots of options. And so in this layout that you're seeing, I put them all going the same direction. This might look tedious to you, but it is really a good way to do a whole bunch of blocks at one time and get a really fascinating way using the fabrics. Now, another way of putting them together, you can see I put together these into a 4-patch, and this one is called X blocks. And so when you look at this piece, what they've done is they put the pieces together into 4 patches and having them point towards the center. This is probably the most common way for you to see signature blocks. Now in this next one, what I chose that first one, which would be called furrows, field and furrows. And what I did was I centered it towards the upper left, and you'll see that center of an O. And then what I did was I turned the pieces so that they basically went around that center. I could do this symmetrically, or I could do this asymmetrically. So the version that I'm showing you here is an asymmetrical layout. And this comes from just playing with the blocks, laying them out, going back and looking at it the next day, seeing what you think about it. And this way, when I'm doing this, I would lay the whole thing out, and then I would come back and work with it. As you see on this piece, I lightened up that background fabric. So I did like a lavender. And you can see you're starting to see that asymmetrical a little bit. When I do the renderings like these, sometimes they don't show up as well as what you're going to see when you actually do the fabrics, especially if you take your time and get a good contrast for your fabrics. Now this one, these are K fabrics, and I paired it up with fabric that's a solid called Highlight, which looks like a highlighter. And you can see, while it may not be your favorite way to do it, it does the job with these fabrics in this rendition. I always prefer to work with fabrics over working in a software program, and those are some of my preferences to come up with better designs. Now, let's look at some designs by some other people. And if you notice, this is the one that I was showing you. This is one of the most common signature blocks that isn't really ever written as a signature block. And you're going to see this frequently. And I love this block. I love using it for scraps. Now this one is putting the pieces together into the clover, but attaching in a sashing that has a little square to make them look like flowers. And this is a terrific signature block. This signature block in particular pairs up the signature block with an alternate setting. Now on this one in particular, it's written as half square triangles, but what I want you to see is that now you're a little more skilled with Y seams. You're going to be able to do some of these pieces. So this next one is pairing it up with just sashings. And so this is achieved by putting sashings in between that fit in there and make the crosses in there. Very unique setting, and I'd love to see you do this in other colorways. Now again, the next quilt that we're going to show you is another version where you see close up. This is using a very tiny sashing. So when I was showing you how to make a lot of these pieces at one time, you can see the signature block looks way more impactful when you start pairing it up with other elements. And all that is just adding a sashing in between. Now in this particular rendition, they did the sashings, but they didn't do the cornerstones. Almost looks like a totally different piece where the signature blocks are floating. This is not cheating because the block is simple. We have a tendency to avoid these things because we think it's so simple looking. Why would I want to do that if I could do something complicated? Now this is what traditional signature block work looks like. So what they did is they did the reverse of this. So the signature blocks are actually the background, and then all I did was sash it together. That's because that signature, that diagonal, is big enough to do signatures like for wedding quilts or for graduation quilts. Here's another version of putting that signature block together with just 4 patches. So it's the 4 patch, the signature block, etc. Really simple way to do this. And again, if you have like a small wedding that you don't have a lot of signatures, this is going to be great to do this. Now in this one, this is putting together the first rendition where I showed you where they put the signature blocks in with those smaller units. So the 2.5-inch squares that they put in those other pieces. This gives you the chance to have a little bit more intricate design. But all it is putting 2 blocks together. This is what, these are some interesting signature block quilts that I found out online. And what they did was they paired on this one up, put photographs in there along with their signature blocks. And you can see these signature blocks are set on point. Here's another rendition of a signature block. It's that same piece that I showed you. And what they did was they crafted in the width of 2 signature blocks, and they put a photograph in there as the epicenter of the rendition of the signature blocks. And so if you were to do a signature block quilt, what I would recommend that you do is cutting squares that are about 5 inches and then putting them onto ironing them to a freezer paper. People then can write on them. Some people will actually draw a chalk frame in there so they show them how big they don't, the space they want to work on. Your call. Give it a try. Now, this is more like what traditional signature blocks look like. This is the O block, and this is in your handouts. All that little O block is it's just a 4 patch of signature blocks. And in this one, they added again a fascinating sashing in between that gave it a totally different look. Very charming for those little charms. Now, this is a favorite of mine. What they did was they took the block that I've been showing you, and on that outer piece, they made borders out of that piece by putting that spacer in there. That spacer is the same width as other pieces, probably a 2.5-inch cut. Here's the same quilt where without the spacer, what they did was they just put negative space of a background fabric around the outside edge. Fascinating. This is a great use of a lot of fabrics, and your signature block becomes a helper unit to put together all those small 2.5-inch squares. It's a great way to use it. Now, here's another signature block in particular, and this was where they used it as a signature, and they crafted in applique as that epicenter, but then they put the applique as a border around the outside edge. Again, signature block paired up with very small sashings. Those are probably only 1-inch sashings, friends. Really, I mean, it way uh, more fascinating than signature blocks. So for this Mystery Monday, you've got a really easy block to work with. And however, what ends up happening is it's in the setting where the secret is. Now, in this particular signature block, I will tell you that this is probably an elongated signature block, and they probably paper piece this in. But I wanted you to see what happens when you use bigger units. This one is called Stretch Stars, and it is just a signature block. And again, lots of little scraps of half square triangles. Look at how fascinating that looks in that setting. This was one of the first quilts that I would have made, and I found that real fascinating to put together. Now in this one, the signature block put together in the X's as the alternating blocks, and then all it is put together with a 4.5-inch square that's framed with 2.5-inch sashings around it, and it's just the alternate blocks. And you can see it's a really great piece that has pieces that are in there that are interesting. Now in this one, they took the signature block and they set it on point, and they made it as so it looks offset. And so in this one, it not only is set on point, but it also has vertical sashings to it. And then what they did was put half square triangles around the outside edge. This is the traditional unit of what we normally see signature blocks. So if you have a charm pack, this is going to work perfect with your 8-inch cube and just putting it together in there. Can you do Y seams in there? Well, you can try. It's worth a try, but I'm not sure. Now, here's one where I love what they've done with the interplay on this one. They've got the signature block in there, and what it's really doing, again, it's the backgrounds, but it's all paired together instead with like 4.5-inch squares. So this isn't all the tiny square piecing. So that's a really interesting way to put it together. Now the next piece that I'm showing you, this is a block where what I did was I took the signature block and I paired it up with the parallelograms. Fascinating, right? It's a really great way of pairing together your lessons. Now, because I know you're developing skills, that center square on this one I made just as a square. You could just as easily make that a square on point. You could do it as a 4-patch. You could do it as a pinwheel. This block is really going to be very impactful, and it's pairing together the lesson that we did with learning about parallelograms with your signature block. Hey, thanks for being inspired to sew with us. I look forward to what you do with the signature block. I want to make it signaturely, which is not a word. I want it to make it your own signature of sewing. I hope you have a lot of fun with this one. It really is for summer sewing as we are in right now. This is the way to go and pull out a stash of charm squares or layer cakes and turn it into something simple, fast. Take care. I hope you're inspired to sew more and more with us. Thank you for referring us to your friends. We take that very seriously, and we're going to work hard to help you be inspired to sew more every time you work with us.